This is a reading of Love Over Gold by Susanna James, the untold story of TV's greatest romance, it says on the front cover, Nescafe's Gold Blend Couple. I don't own the rights to Love Over Gold, and anyone who does needs to take a long look at themselves. April in Venice. A pale, golden day, with one of those blue skies which made you remember the last time you fell in love. A hint of summer's heat already in the air. Matthew Prescott sat at a small, marble-topped table in the Piazzetta San Marco, smiling at nothing in particular. The waiter brought him a second espresso, and he drank the tiny cup of strong black coffee slowly, staring across the Grand Canal past the magnificent facades of Santa Maria della Salute, to where the sun danced and sparkled on the waters of the lagoon. Although the first summery frocks were in evidence, the tourists had still not begun their seasonal descent on the city. It would be June before the gannet migration of camera-clutching seekers after culture took place, ruining the city for those who lived and worked there, clogging the ancient squares, filling the restaurants and cafes, disturbing the air with 1,000 alien tongues. But for the moment, Venice was at its best. It was the perfect day, in the perfect city, and there he was, drinking a coffee in perhaps the most perfect square in Europe. What more could a man ask for? He stretched out his long legs and frowned. As a matter of fact, a man could ask for a whole lot more than this. Quite apart from anything else, a man could reasonably ask for the perfect companion to be added to the list of other perfections. And 2 weeks ago, he would have had no hesitation, if asked, in nominating Gabriella for the role. Beautiful Gabriella. But then, 2 weeks ago, he wouldn't have had to nominate. She'd have been there with him as a matter of course. He shook his head gloomily. 14 days is a long time in a love affair, especially a love affair which, let's face it, was dying on its feet, if not already dead. Curious punctuation there. He had been slow on the uptake, no doubt about that. It had been a long while before he realised what was happening, though at the age of 34 he ought to have been able to recognise a brush-off when he got one. Because even if at first he had assumed it was just another of Gabby's temperamental flounces, brush-off he now saw was indubitably what it was. What else would you call it when a woman refused to return your phone calls, didn't answer the door when you called round, sent your letters back unread, or so she would have you believe? Despite himself, he smiled. Gabby was probably the nosiest woman he'd ever met. He knew perfectly well that she would have been unable to resist holding the envelopes over a hot kettle and steaming them open before she sent them back to him. She was always saying that she liked a good read, and those letters must certainly have provided her with one, especially since he had written most of them after a session alone in his Rome apartment with only a wine bottle for company. Yeah, well, he got the message now, thanks. It was over. He and Gabby were washed up. Finished. Finito. He kicked at the pedestal of the little round table and wished he could be more heartbroken about it. The trouble was, he'd been able to see the split coming for quite a while. The two of them were basically completely incompatible. He, a phlegmatic Englishman, and she, a volatile American Italian. The thing was doomed from the start. At first he'd found their spectacular rows, always her fault, of course, rather stimulating. It wasn't what he was used to. Then they began to irritate, to exhaust, and finally to bore. And this last one, when he told her that he was being transferred back to London. London? She had said incredulously, her voice rising. No way. You seriously think I'm going to live in London, filth capital of the world? Rome's not exactly renowned for its squeaky clean image, he retorted, stung by that criticism. And what about New York, if it comes to that, your own hometown? What about it? Last time I was there, the garbage was piled higher than the Empire State Building. Ha, ha, ha. I added that, but I feel like it was implied. She ignored that as she ignored anything she found inconvenient. "But why are you going to London?" she demanded, standing in the blue-tile kitchen of the apartment he had been renting for the past year and a half. Behind her, steam rose from the pan in which she was boiling spaghetti. "I don't have much choice," he tried to explain. "If the firm wants me to go back to England, then that's what I have to do." She banged a saucepan full of bolognese sauce down on the stove, forcefully enough for some of it to slop out onto the gas ring. He tried very hard to keep the "guess who's going to have to clear that up later" kind of expression off his face. "Aren't we good together, huh?" she demanded. "Is that it? Don't you enjoy it with me anymore?" She opened the door of the refrigerator, then kicked it shut again. "I love you, you know that," he said, wincing as she dropped a pan lid on the floor and it skittered noisily into silence. "Then why the hell are you going, Matt?" She switched on the mixmaster, then adjusted the knob of the radio to compensate for the sound of the whirring machine. Is that relevant? I'm not sure that's relevant. He had grabbed her by the elbows, turned down the radio, switched off the mixer. "Listen," he had said, his face an inch from her huge black eyes. "I don't have a choice in the matter, okay? I've got a job, a good job, and as an art investment counsellor, I have to go where there's counselling to be done. What's wrong with Rome?" It was hard to believe that this was a girl with a good degree in art history from Berkeley. Or Berkeley, I'm not sure. "Nothing at all is wrong with Rome," he said patiently, "but I've done my stint here and the firm want to give me a different field to cover." "Why can't you cover it from here? There's plenty of rich guys in Rome need someone to tell them what kind of paintings they ought to be buying, what they ought to offload. I mean, basically that is what you do, isn't it, Matt?" "Basically, I suppose it is. But so why can't you stay in Rome?" He shook her hard. Christ. "Have you got shares in the city or what?" he said, angered by her obstinacy. "I go where I'm sent, okay? Besides, I want to go back. Do you understand that? I've been here for 18 months now, and I want to go back home. To England. To London." She had stood with one hand on her hip. Even with her black hair coming loose from its combs and a smudge of tomato sauce on her chin, she was unbearably pretty. And I'm supposed to come with you?" she asked. He had made the fatal mistake of hesitating. That was it. With a dramatic gesture borrowed from the Italian grandmother who, the way Gabriella told it, had terrorized 3.5 city blocks in Brooklyn for over 30 years, she dumped the half-cooked spaghetti into the kitchen sink. The bolognese sauce she'd spent most of the day preparing followed. Tearing off her apron, she had stomped out. He hadn't seen her since. Sitting now in Venice with the sun glinting off the golden archangel on top of the Campanile and a salty breeze blowing in from the lagoon, he shrugged. Why the hell had he hesitated? Why had he been unable to say wholeheartedly, "Yes, Gabriella, I want you to come to England with me"? She would have come if he'd asked, he knew that. Even though both of them shied away from any commitment, even though they avoided using the word love. But faced with the possibility, standing there in the steamy kitchen with the bolognese sauce blurping like a mudhole, he had realised all at once that he couldn't cope with the noise level. He tried to tell her once. "Noise?" she'd said, slamming a door shut, dropping a bunch of knives and forks on the table, banging some glasses about. "What damn noise?" And when he'd explained that she'd moved in a permanent jet stream of the stuff, whirring, grinding, singing, shouting, running baths or marathons or seminars on primal therapy for other expat American girls, right there in his living room, she had uttered the first in what seemed like an endless series of screams, each one a higher decibel count than the last. It exhausted him just to think about it. He gestured to the waiter for another espresso. Outside one of the cafes across the square, an orchestra was playing an old jazz tune. Fat pigeons waddled, red beaks pecking at the corn which children were throwing for them. It was impossible to avoid feeling guilty about Gabriella. However much he pointed out to himself that he had promised her nothing, that she'd asked for nothing, that it was understood between them, that it was just one of those nights, well, one of those 8 months to be exact. He still felt like a major heel. Was he a male chauvinist because he found that if peace was what you were looking for, you might as well bed down on the M25 as let a woman move in with you. Was he an unreconstructed male simply because he longed to find a girl who didn't need several paragraphs to say what could be said in a single sentence? A girl who didn't bang and crash and shout, a girl with... He let the fancy wash over him, knowing it was no more than an unrealizable dream. One of those rich, deep, quiet voices which sounded like melted chocolate being poured over honey and left a man feeling weak at the knees. A gondola slipped past the end of the piazza, heading out towards Murano. Recognizing the man in it, Matt raised his hand in a half salute. Riccardo San Lorenzo, the client he had driven up here at the beginning of the week to see. His last assignment before he went back to London on Monday. Riccardo San Lorenzo, who had made a great deal of money out of reproduction furniture, was a man stuck firmly on the horns of a dilemma almost as tough as Hamlet's. A man unable to make up his mind which he wanted more, to be recognised as a patron of the arts, or to spit in the eye of Carlo, his nephew and heir. That was an incredibly long sentence. Since by working towards the first aim he also achieved the second, Riccardo ought to have been a happy man. The amount of money he had recently spent on buying modern art, ably advised and assisted by Matthew Prescott, it went without saying, ensured that by the time Carlo came into his inheritance, there'd be damn little inheritance left for him to come into. Unfortunately, as well as Carlo, Riccardo also had a demanding mistress. He was probably on his way to see her now. And what she demanded more than anything else was diamonds and real estate. No one could blame her if Carlo ended up a rich man. The way Riccardo told it, she was doing her level best to reduce the amount of Riccardo's fortune available for the purchase of anything at all, let alone for works of art. Again, Matt smiled. He had not met Carlo San Lorenzo, who worked as a public relations consultant in Milan. Carlo seldom came to Venice. Carlo had apparently stated several times that as far as he was concerned, his uncle's art collection could be dropped in the nearest sewer. What can you do with a Philistine like this, Riccardo said frequently, turning his mouth down at the corners, spreading his shoulders wide, shrugging hugely. Disinherit him, Matthew suggested, the first time this admittedly rhetorical question was put to him. Riccardo had been shocked. He is the heir, he explained. The eldest male, my poor sister's son. Of course I cannot disinherit him. See to it then that he can't sell off your collection, Matthew said, and that, duly, was what Riccardo was in the process of doing. He and Matthew had spent the best part of the past week together, walking through the high, half-empty rooms of Riccardo's palazzo on the Grand Canal, discussing business, discussing paintings. And all the time, the light reflecting off the canal sent a panorama of watery images across the ceilings and the dusty marble floors, so that the whole place seemed constantly to shimmer. They had become friends, he and Riccardo. Once their business was done each day, they spent hours on the roof terrace, companionably watching the bar at Vient, the busy bustle of the canal, the swarming tourists in the narrow streets below, the birds wheeling at sunset over the intricate Venetian roofscapes. Their discussions were punctuated by long, elaborate meals, during which Riccardo would complain incessantly, either about Carlo or his importunate mistress, or even, when the second bottle of wine was almost empty, about the intricacies of his digestive tract, which, frankly, he assured Matt, with another engaging Italian shrug, was giving him unmitigated jip. Down in the square, Matt called for the bill. Nothing, not Gabriella, nor Riccardo, nor the total lack in his life of women with beautiful voices could ruin the day for him. Tomorrow, he would drive back to Rome, pack up his apartment, most of his stuff had already been sent ahead to his London flat, attend the last farewell party at the firm's grand headquarters off the Via Veneto, and on Monday he would take the first flight out. Now He had a couple of hours before his final meeting with Ricardo, time to stroll one last time through this most beautiful city, to look at some of the finest art treasures in the world, and forget that he was here alone. If I ever find her, he told himself, pushing back his chair and standing up, I'll bring her here, this woman with the soft voice. He stood for a moment on the Molo, the waterfront of the Piazza San Marco, and watched the gondolas and excursion boats bobbing and rocking on the water. I shall fall instantly in love with her, he told himself, and wished he believed it. Falling in love implied commitment, and Matthew Prescott was definitely not into commitment. Not after giving his heart to Laura all those years ago, only to have it returned in 1,000 tiny pieces. He'd been trying to put it back together again ever since, and one way of doing that was to avoid falling in love ever again. Love. He turned and walked past the Doge's palace towards the Ponte della Paglia and leaned on the stone balustrade to look at the Bridge of Sighs. Love, in spite of Gabriella, was a commodity distinctly missing from his life at the moment. He had plenty of friends. He had a loving family, but love? 5 years ago, perhaps even 2, he would have laughed at himself for giving it a thought, let alone worrying about it. But increasingly, he was beginning to wonder if the determinedly single lifestyle he had made for himself was really what he wanted. Was it old age creeping up on him, or a deeper dissatisfaction with the way things were turning out? He turned to gaze as the Vaporetto crept up to the landing stage, and a group of girls disembarked, laughing and chattering, pretty as a cage full of finches. Pretty as a cage full of finches. Idly he watched them. Once his pulses might have quickened, but at 34 he had lost any taste he ever had for 20-year-olds. He wanted someone more mature, someone with a mind of her own, a career of her own, someone who was looking, as he himself was, for something more out of life than the mortgage and marriage trap, the 2.4 kids and the Volvo estate in the double garage. She was out there somewhere, he was certain. It was just a question of finding her. But as the breezes ruffled his hair, he knew that even if he did, he would probably pull back. Matthew Prescott, the king of no commitments, was he really likely to change his ways now?